Good morning. Welcome. If you have a fault on an inter-array cable circuit, 66 kV cable, standard configuration, 8 megawatt turbines, 5 turbines on the string, and that cable is off for one day, just one day, it cancels out the hard work of 350,000 trees absorbing carbon for the year. And I was staggered when I actually worked that out, and I had to keep checking it because I thought, this can't be right. But it is. It's amazing the impact that it can have. We all think about the financial impact of cable downtime, but the environmental impact is significant. In fact, even in the first minute of this talk, that's 250 trees for a year. So, I guess I better get a move on. We've been chasing cable faults for 10 years. And what I wanted to share with you is some very practical advice from our experience of dealing with cable faults in James Fisher. Some principles, some lessons learned, and something that you can take away that you can bring back to your operation that we know will have a real impact on this situation. And the first thing is very simple. And it's a principle called chase the wind, not the fault. And I've just talked about chasing faults, and I think the problem is often whenever we have a fault, the first thing we do is think to ourselves, how are we going to get someone to site? Who's that going to be? What am I going to do about it? And we forget sitting right in front of us is the opportunity to get generation back on. Chase the wind, not the fault. Think about generation. It's not the cable fault that you're trying to fix here. It's your loss of generation. And you can sit, and we've seen it happen for many days where people are trying to figure out what to do about their fault, and they've got an opportunity to switch the circuit back another way, to get the generation going back around the string, and to get as much of the rest of their asset generating as possible. So the first principle we've learned, lesson learned, pause. Pause and think to yourself, what can I do to minimize the impact of this fault on the rest of my network? Sounds simple, it is simple, but often it's the simple things catch us out. The second one is communicate, communicate, communicate. Before we connect cables, we have to connect people. Whenever we have a fault, we found that one of the biggest barriers to getting things back up and running is not the technical solutions. It's not knowing where to look for the right type of equipment, although those are important things. What we've found is that it's all the noise. So you get a call 2 a.m. in the morning, you hear there's a fault on the site, you know that the grid operator is going to want to report, you know that the board are going to want to know what's the next steps. Your site engineers are in your ear saying, look, we knew this was going to happen, we told you about this. Lots of noise. Lots of communication, but not good communication. You're drowning in a sea and a tangled web of noise, and you haven't even got anybody to site yet. So what you need to do, and what our experience is, find a way as soon as possible to identify, if you can do in advance, who are the stakeholders, who do I need to get informed, how do I keep them informed regularly, so that we can remove all that noise that actually massively, every minute, every hour that goes by, lots of phone calls, unstructured communication, this gets in the way. This isn't complex, but it's hard. So communicate, communicate, communicate. That's what we found. And lastly, and this is the one that I really want to focus on right now, which is the power of planning. You want to maximize your downtime. Sorry for this. You gotta minimize your downtime. You gotta maximize your preparation. And this is where it all comes to play. We've seen it happen so many times. What do? When the fault happens, there are so many things that you can do in advance to be prepared for that day. And we know day-to-day operations is a grind. You've got other fires to fight. And how many of us really want to think about that fire that hasn't happened? We don't know when it's going to happen. It might happen at some point in the future. I mightn't even be there. How many of us want to take the time to think about that? And that's why I love this quote. Great quote. In times of peace, the soldier carries out maneuvers. 2,000 years old, that quote. Seneca. Some things don't change. Some things don't change. And these are the simple things that we've seen catch us out time and again. So what does that actually mean in practice? To plan ahead. How do we plan ahead for a fault? What are the things that we have to think about? Our recommendation would be step back and think about everything. This is just some of the points. Taken from left to right, we have strategic spares. Do you have the joints available? Are the terminations there? Have you got spare cable? Importantly, are the materials in date? I'll come on to that. Are the materials to spec? Are the materials tested and ready, so when you need them? The equipment. Have you thought about your fiber optics, your power cores, your earth sheaths? How are you going to test those? What type of equipment are you going to use? If you have it, is it ready to use that equipment for testing? If you don't have it, have you got the supply chain relationships to get it there when you need it? Documentation. So much time is spent trying to create documents to do your risk assessments and method statements. All this stuff can be done in advance. Supplier contracts, your fault plans. Don't think about what your fault strategy is when it happens. Think about it in advance. Access, very simple one, catches us out often. Do you know where you're actually going to go to test your cable? Do you know where you're going to go to how you're going to get the test equipment onto the platform? Think through it in advance. And your fault management strategy, as I said, faults can go down lots of different routes. There's lots of different scenarios. In an inter-array cable, you've got three primary scenarios, I guess. You've got a fault happening at subsea, you've got a fault on the termination, or you've got a fault somewhere within the turbine, okay? But the types of faults that you can have can vary. High resistance, low resistance, what type of equipment you're going to use. You can plan all that out in advance, so you've got your roadmap, so you know what you're going to do. And lastly, the operational element, the personnel. What type of team is going to be out there to fix the fault? What's the competence makeup? Is it going to be insourced, outsourced? Are you going to do it in collaboration? How are you going to tackle that? Consider all these elements. Now, this isn't everything, and there's a lot to think about. But all I wanted to do was leave you with one simple thing to take away, that if you can influence this, it's going to impact your site, and it's going to help your site be best prepared for when a fault happens. One thing to take away. There's a lot more than this, and I don't want to fry everyone's brain with information overload. Your first step to powering through and being prepared for faults, simple one. And this is the one we've chosen. In our experience, 50% of sites have out-of-date spares. We turn up on a site, there's a spare that could help us get that asset back on again. It's out of date. Very simple. At this day, and in this climate, you could be talking 8 to 12 weeks lead time. Going back to the tree analogy, that's 30 million trees for a year. Something like, if anybody knows, the New Forest in England, same size as the New Forest in England for a year, for want of not checking that you've got strategic spares in place. If it's not your job to do it, speak to your manager, speak to your operations manager, make sure that they're thinking about this, that they're on top of this. This will have real, meaningful impact on your site if a fault happens. This is what we see time and again. And just to summarize what I've said, chase the wind, not the fault. Communicate. Remember the power of planning and take your first step in being prepared to power through in the case of a fault. And that's all I have for you. I'm here. Our cable expert, Ross Piercy, is here also. If anybody wants to speak to us about how we might be able to help you think through these things, we're delighted to. We just wanted to share something today from the lessons that we've learned in dealing with faults. Thank you.